FTC 7129, and today we have Jared Phillips, an FTC alum and John Deere technician intern. What do you do now?
So I service and repair large ag equipment, tractors and combines, all the way down to riding mowers and the ATVs they have.
Today we will be covering the importance of robot maintenance and talking about factors to consider when designing a robot with maintenance in mind. We will also discuss different types of hardware and other fabrication tips that will make your robot more reliable. Could you explain to us the importance of having good robot maintenance while we're designing and planning it for our season?
Well, one thing to keep in mind for sure, your robot's going to break. Things just break in general. Parts are going to wear out, screws are going to get loose, parts are going to break. So you need to keep in mind, hey, because this thing is going to break, how can we make it easy to work on? Be able to get into tight spots to tighten screws and replace parts. You need to keep these in mind when you're building it so you don't get it all the way built, have a servo in the middle, and it dies 3 minutes before your next match at the competition, and then you're really in a bad spot and you're going to lose the match because of that. You want to avoid stuff like that. So be sure that you're building your robot, keeping in mind, hey, we're going to have to fix stuff on this because it is going to break.
So what are some parts on the robot that commonly fail, like maybe motors or things like that? What are some parts that you should be looking out for when you're designing that will normally fail?
Well, a lot of electrical components, because these things are not made to have a lot of stress put on them necessarily. So motor gearboxes, for instance, are a part that do fail over time. They will wear out or break, and then you need to replace them. So that's one to keep in mind. Servos as well. They will strip out if you load them too much. They will have other issues like that. Being able to replace servos quickly and efficiently is very important too. And this may seem really, really simple, but screws loosen up. Screws, well, they don't really break normally, but they loosen up very easily. And then that's a problem. Your robot's basically shaking itself to bits as it's driving across the field. So it's subject to a lot of vibration normally, and the screws loosen up because of that. So make sure you're tightening the screws as much as you can, making sure if you see a loose screw, go ahead and tighten it now, because now there's no better time than the present, right?
Are there ways that you would recommend to be able to keep screws from getting loose in the first place, or to be able to minimize that problems you'll have there?
Well, one of the things that we would always do when we were building the robot a couple years back when I was on the team, so we would use lock nuts all the time, the nylon locking nuts. We'll show you those a little bit later. We would use those as much as we could, but in certain applications where we couldn't use that, for instance on a clamping hub or those C-mounts that we'll also show you later, if it's just threading into a hole, there's no nylon to lock it in place or any other locking mechanism part of that. So what you have to do, or what we did a lot of the time, is use some Loctite on it, and that was a really good way to keep the screws from getting loose. Basically, it's a glue to hold the screws in place. So even under a lot of vibration, they likely are not going to get loose. So with blue Loctite, it's basically a general purpose formula, basically. What you can also use is red Loctite, but this is only a last resort. If the blue was not working very well, if it was still loosening up, because even though you're using the blue, that's when you might move to red Loctite. I believe there's also another Loctite. It's a green color, I think, and it's a step below the blue Loctite, not as strong, so you might look into that. But we always use blue as a general purpose, and that worked very well.
Before a match, is there like a checklist that we could follow to make sure our robot's in working condition and all our screws and everything's working?
Absolutely. What we did when I was on the team a couple years ago, I believe the team still does that now, is we would, in our drive practice, we would make a list of and write down things that would go wrong on our robot, things we'd have to fix periodically. And we would compile that list in preparation for competition, and that way we'd have a list of things that need attention before every match. And we called it a pre-match checklist. What we would do is we would go through that pre-match checklist, and it'd be various things like making sure the side panels, the screws for that were tight, checking clamping hubs, and making sure that the motors were turned down and the gears were meshing fine. Various things like that. Also making sure that robot components and functions are ready to go. is the lift rewound properly? All sorts of things like that. Making sure the robot is in tip-top shape to win that match so we can win the competition.
We've talked a little bit through this video about different screws and fasteners and things like that. Could you show us up close what you were talking about now and describe those a little bit more?
Sure thing. We'll start with some of the different fasteners we use. What we have here is just your normal screw. This is a little longer than what we normally use. We normally use one that's more closer to this size, right here. But this is easier for me to hold, so that's what I'm using right now. This is what we call a kept nut. At least that's a name I've heard a lot of the time. It is considered a locking nut, but as you can see, the threads don't lock. What it relies on to lock is this little castle, you know, like a castle tower. It's basically a crown on top of it, and that goes into the material, the aluminum normally, and it makes it tight that way. However, these loosen up a lot. They can be really handy if you're building something quick, but they're not always that good for keeping things tight a long time. What the team has started to use a few years ago are these nylon locking nuts. They have a, on the back side looks about the same as the front side of this. However, on this side you can see there's that kind of cream colored plastic inside there, and that's what locks the nut onto the thread. So there, I have it bottomed out tight as much as it'll get. So I'm actually going to tighten this up for you guys, and you'll see that it does not come loose very easy. I cannot take this out with my fingers, you know, at all. It's very tight in there. Not too tight to turn with a wrench and an Allen wrench like that, but not too bad, and it does a good job holding the hardware together. Now, some things you won't always be able to use a nylon locking nut like that. For instance, one of these is a C-mount, and this goes in the end of an Activox channel. We can throw a picture of that up right now. But what happens a lot is you thread into this, and you go in there, and you get it tightened up to the channel or whatever you're tightening, but that's it. It has no way to lock itself. So what we do then a lot of times is if it's a part we know is going to be together a long time, we're going to go ahead and put some blue Loctite on it, and that way it'll basically glue itself in there. You're not going to have to worry about it coming loose over time the same way. Much like that with a clamping hub like this, it's basically the same scenario. It just threads right in. There's nothing really to lock it in place, and so that's a really good time to use Loctite as well. Now while we're here with a clamping hub, I'll show you a couple different versions. So this would be your normal clamping hub. It's a circular inside hole, and then that slit there, as you tighten this screw here down, it clamps onto the shaft. So that theoretically works pretty well. It's basically friction is all that you're relying on to hold the clamping hub to the axle. What we found would work very well is using a D shaft clamping hub. You'll see there, it looks like a D in the hole there, and that's used with a D shaft axle, which has that one side cut out of it. We can show a picture of that right now as well. But that way you have an active way that it's held onto the shaft. It doesn't. It may tend to slide this way on the shaft, you know, and that's where the clamping comes in and helps a lot. But it's not going to spin on the shaft this way, and that helps a lot to make parts more reliable that way. Another way, another set of clamping hubs we have here is a just normal round. This uses a set screw to tighten down to the shaft. One benefit of this, it's smaller. It doesn't have this tab on here, so you can put it in tighter spaces for different applications. It's a very helpful feature. We also have the D shaft on that too, with a D on it, and that's very helpful again with the D shaft, and that way it will not spin on the shaft this way. Again, it can slide this way, but it won't spin that way.
What are the best tools to keep on hand and keep handy for robot maintenance when you're drive practicing and when you're getting ready to go onto a match?
So right here we have a normal Allen wrench or a hex key. They have many names for it, but I'm sure all of you have used one of these. You've got the long end here for more leverage, and the small end it's normally easier to turn with your fingers like that. But one thing that can be really annoying is if you're in a tight spot, you can't get it this way, and you can't get it that way. You know, if you have to get in kind of at an angle, That's where the ball and Allen wrench comes in. What you'll see here is it's got a little area cut out of that. Basically what it does, instead of having to come in straight, you can come in at an angle and still turn the wrench. And it is so helpful to have these. If your team does not have a set of these, make sure you get a set of these. They are so handy, they make your life so much easier, and you'll have a lot less headaches servicing your robot when you're tightening up the screws and everything else you have there. What we have here is just a normal wrench. This is a 5/16 inch wrench. It's a 6-point in the back. Normally they're 12-point, and then an open end. So it's called a combination wrench. And so that works well with your nuts for the robot. But what can be really annoying is that you have to take it off and put it back on all the time. So that's when ratcheting wrenches come in very handy. That way you can get on here, there we go, and then you can tighten it, and it's a ratcheting action. Makes your life a lot easier. So like for this, I can sit here and tighten this up a whole lot easier, and it will not want to stay in my hand, but that's okay. You can tighten it up a whole lot easier, and it makes life much better. These are very handy to have as well. That just about sums up all the different types of tools that you can use. There are many other tools that can help you, but these are some basic tips on what tools and what hardware to use to make your robot better.
I think that wraps up our discussion on robot maintenance. Thank you so much for coming out and talking with us, Jared, and thank you guys all for watching.
Thank you for watching this video on robot maintenance with Jared, a John Deere technician intern. This is our 8th video in our Game On series, and next week's video will be on team management. Stay tuned. Bye.